Hey everybody, what's up? Welcome to this episode of the CEO's Guide to Marketing. Today, I'm super happy to be sitting with Vineet Mehra, who's the CMO of Chime. And Vineet, I'm going to dispense with, and we'll get back to the traditional bio read, because you like to keep it spicy. I like it when you keep it spicy. So let's just get into it. First of all, though, welcome.
Thanks, Seth. Congrats on all the success you're having with this. I'm hearing people are listening to this all over the place, so glad to be a part of it.
Let that be a reminder to our listeners to smash that subscribe button and give us 5 stars on multiple platforms, right? Just keep hitting that 5-star button. All right, look, let's go right into it. Here are the 7 questions we start every episode with. From your perspective, fill in the blanks. Marketing is
the art and science of connecting your brand functionally and emotionally to your audience to drive efficient growth.
I like both. I like the couplings, the art and science, of course, but I love kind of the emotional and functional appeal. And let's remember as we go on to talk about whether the functional piece is a brand role or a product/service role, because that could be interesting. All right, with that said, and maybe actually we'll get there right now, fill in the blank here, my guy. A brand is
the intentional promise you've chosen to make to your customer or target audience.
Okay. The hardest part of
though, that
yeah, go
it's
on.
owned by everyone in the organization and not just marketing.
Yes, I talked to Kofi a couple of weeks ago, and he made the same point. And I think more and more, and I think it's a real lesson for the rest of the C-suite who think that brand is divorced from their role and the singular province of the CMO, as if the CMO had singular control and influence over it. I'm sure we'll talk about that. So actually, it's not a bad segue into the next question. What's the hardest part of being a CMO from your perspective?
You know, you probably heard me talk about this a lot. We've shared some of this before, but to me, the hardest part is the number of roles we play, right? I think the modern kind of growth-oriented CMO, I always say we're capital allocators. We are product innovators. We are technologists. Like you look at the whole ad tech revolution and the market cap growth of Facebook and Google, we were the technology buyers of that. If you think about that,
Right.
really honestly, we're data scientists, we're experience architects, and more with the advent of all these creative generative AI tools. I mean, more and more of us are in-housing, and we're now creative agency owners. And it's really a very complex job where we play a lot of roles. And I think the hardest part is being able to be dangerous enough across all of those to be successful.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you, which is while all of those areas and more are now within the CMO's world, there's also been a divorce, right? Which is to say, oftentimes I think led by, however unintentionally, those same tech companies, the divorce of brand and product, right? Or marketing and product, right? As organizations, as the world's gotten more complicated, as organizations have become more specialized, there has been both more things put, more expectations and areas of understanding required of CMOs, but also a divorce from responsibility or influence over them in some respects. And I'm wondering if you think any CMO can be proficient in all those things, and how you as a CMO defer to the expertise of those who are more expert in it than you are.
Well, on the brand and product divide, I think you're actually seeing CMOs responding in a couple of ways. Like one is this role of product marketing is, especially in tech companies, is becoming, I think, more and more integral to most organizational structures in the technology space. And what I mean by that, one of the first things I did when I came to Chime is I started a product marketing function, and those folks are deeply embedded into the product teams defining the strategy and the where to play choices we're making from a product standpoint. So I think
can I ask you?
Organizations are adjusting to this reality.
I'm sorry to excuse me. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I actually want to hit pause because for a second, because what you just said is when you got to Chime, you started that. And let me actually use that as a segue to talk about where you were before you became the CMO at Chime, right? Because you've got a really diverse and a much more operational background than a lot of traditional CMOs. So before becoming the CMO of Chime in June of 2022, Vineet was the Global Chief Customer and Marketing Officer at Walgreens Boots Alliance. You'd been the Chief Growth Officer at Ancestry, and even before you moved into tech and retail, you led some of the world's largest, and according to your bio, but I think reasonably easily agreed with, most revered brands at companies like P&P and J&J, where you were in fact global president of J&J's bazillion-dollar baby care division, right? As well as president of the global marketing function. And having interrupted you, and now for a change gone off the script of these first 7 questions, I'm wondering why you think marketing is typically, speaking broadly, divorced from operational responsibility, right? If the marketer's job is to drive sustainable, profitable growth, and, it is, why do so few CMOs have line of sight, let alone responsibility and accountability for a P&L from your perspective?
I mean, I guess it depends on how you define operational,
Fair.
Focus for a CMO.
Yeah.
I might challenge that, right? Because you look at a huge world in our industry, which is CPG, which I can talk to, as you said, from my first 10 years of my career. And there you grow up as a P&L owner of your brand, right? There, the marketing role in CPG is very, I would say, general management oriented. And you literally run the full stack. And frankly, even in tech, a lot of times in direct to consumer tech, at least, you're running direct response media, and your marketing dollars are very attached to the customer acquisition goals of your company. And that customer acquisition cost is one of the most focused in operational metrics of your company. But there are definitely areas, maybe like in B2B and some other areas, where it might be a little bit different. But I'd say in general, we may not be owning the full P&L in all kinds of businesses, but that operational muscle, I think, is actually very strong in many CMOs.
Look, I think it's a completely fair pushback, and CPG tends to remain an exception, I think, broadly, especially as we've become a tech-driven world. And what company isn't a tech company today in many respects? And to your earlier point, it's interesting because I see a lot of spec sheets from recruiters who are looking for CMOs for X, Y, or Z. Almost none of them talk about P&L responsibility. CAC, of course, right? And, everybody's measuring whatever the fuck they're measuring, quite frankly. But I'm not seeing that accountability to growth the way I think it in fact should be, to ensure that the enterprise is optimizing its chances for growth.
Right. I think you might be right from a P&L standpoint. And to be honest, maybe this is a different take than other guests, but I think that could be the nature.
I'm counting on you for a different take than other guests.
I think that could be the nature of some of these tech kind of platform or marketplace oriented businesses, right? To hold the P&L in any one function beyond like the CEO role is actually a really difficult thing to do when you're a multi-product platform, 2-sided or 3-sided marketplace that is operating. So I think part of it could be, frankly, the changing nature of business models that tech has enabled that actually spreads the P&L across most functions and kind of holds it in that CMO's hands. The only other thing I'll share with you, Seth, is like more and more CMOs are entering boards, right? Public boards as well. And I think that's a good sign. It's not represented the way it needs to be. But, for instance, I'm on like the audit committee of a public board, which is really strange for a CMO, right? And
by the way,
I think it's having more and more confidence in boards with CMOs, to be honest.
I'd like to think you're right, and you very well may be. By the way, I don't mean to suggest you aren't, but anecdotally, I would not have the same perspective that more and more CMOs are coming onto these boards. I think your community maybe, but I think more broadly, and I was just having a conversation with John Evans on his Uncensored CMO podcast the other day about exactly this, and it is part of why we started this podcast. But you bring up something that I think is also worth talking about. I was actually listening to, I believe his name is Mark Abraham from
Yeah,
BCG
he's a
on
dear friend
John's
of mine.
Uncensored. Oh, great. Okay. So John was on, I mean, Mark was on John's podcast. And he talked about a client. He was talking about personalization, right? And personalization at scale, where he's an author and true expert. And he was referring to a client that had something like, if I remember correctly, 55 different P&Ls, right? Which strikes me as a suboptimal approach to running a singular enterprise. Could be wrong, right? I don't know what the company was. I don't know what the reason was. But what it reminds me of in this moment is that marketers exist in a world where, and it goes back to what you were saying about the enterprise. Everybody in the company owns the brand, or at least contributes to or detracts from it. But marketers market in a world where everything connects, but not everything is connected. And I'm wondering what counsel you have, given all the time you spend advising CEOs and C-suites and boards, on how to ensure that more is connected, and the role of marketing, not just the chief marketer, in serving as that kind of connective device and tissue.
Yeah, look, I think the role of marketing to be that connective device has a couple of areas. One is, like you said, we don't own the brand, but I think brand is a great connector across functions. And I always talk about my role as the caretaker or the curator of the brand, right? I may not give all the contributions. I do give some of them, and my team does. But one is, I think you have to be the voice of the consistency of the brand in every decision that's being made across the company. And I think CEOs have to rely on their CMOs to play that role, because I think they're uniquely positioned to do that. I think the second thing is embedding, what I say to CEOs is embedding the marketing function into much more cross-functional sort of squads across a company, right? So as opposed, I think the days of just teams working in functional silos in
Yeah.
organizational designs are over. I think more and more CEOs are starting to create be much more intentional about multiple functions: finance, product, marketing, data science, engineering, are starting to come together to solve the biggest, hairiest problems in the company. So I think the mindset I would suggest, and I know this is about the CEO's guide to working with marketing, has got to be, think about your org as an ecosystem, and wherever possible, don't try to solve problems in functional silos. Bring functions together against the biggest problems and priorities in your company. And I think you're going to get much better results. And I think marketing is a huge part of that equation.
Yeah, is that what Brian Chesky has kind of called founders mode recently? I was listening to him speak about it somewhere, and he mentioned that he had, back to 55, something like 55 direct reports. Jensen Wang, I think, has, or maybe that was Jensen Wang, but an extraordinary number of direct reports. And the perspective is, as I recall, and I found it absolutely on point, and it was a change of opinion on my part, which is, everybody needs to be on the same page. Everybody needs to be focused against the same things. And 55 P&Ls, to go back to Mark's point, has everybody operating in P&L, if assuming everybody's accountable, and they are, to the individual P&L, everybody's operating against one thing as opposed to the totality, which is the enterprise. And it just seems to me that the whole winds up being equal to less than the sum of its parts more often than not there.
I think you're right. Optimizing to 55 local maximas is going to not optimize for the whole. And
it's so fucked up.
And this is kind of what I said about why P&Ls are getting more distributed. It's not all the way there yet, Seth, but I do think the advice, or the way I would think about marketing, the context of a modern enterprise is, integrate it all, pull it to the top, and recognize the roles of different functions in driving the business together, not separately.
So it's a good segue to the next question, which is, what's the hardest part of being a CEO?
I always say to people that the hardest part of being the C-suite in general is loneliness. And,
Mm.
it seems from the outside that you're in all the action, you're in all the meetings, you're in all those things. But I think the CEO role is the ultimate, most lonely role there is.
Well,
You
as
hear
they say, it's lonely at the top.
It really is. You hear everyone's opinions. You sometimes have to make can't win decisions where, I always say every decision I make, and I think a CEO is even more, 30% of people love it, 30% of people don't care, and 30% of people will 40% of people will hate it. And I think the CEO is in this position every single day. And that's got to be the hardest part about being a CEO, and why I have a lot of empathy for the people that I've worked with.
You talked earlier about the role of the CMO. Your role as being, just looking at my notes, a capital allocator, right? If we think about capital, not just as finances, but as time and human, right? Human time dedicated, allocated, given, and human resources. It seems that's the same job as the CEOs ultimately, right?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, the job of a CMO, first and foremost, is to be a commercial leader.
Yeah.
And brand to me is focusing or choosing to focus on brand as a strategic mode for your business, to me is a strategy. It's a choice.
Couldn't agree more.
And then you allocate capital accordingly across channels to drive commercial outcomes.
So when I interviewed or had a conversation, I don't like to think of these as interviews, with Chris Davis from New Balance
Yeah.
on the pod. Chris talked about the difference between a brand leader and a commercial leader. What you just talked about is something that is so near and dear to my heart, which is that it seems so many marketers, let alone the rest of the C-suite, think brand is an objective, when in fact, exactly to your point, it's just a strategy. It's an influencer. It's a
Of course.
differentiator.
Yeah.
And I don't understand why that is less understood than it appears to me to be in my conversations with the hundreds of CMOs I talked to over a period of time. Do you have a point of view on that? Like, how did brand get divorced from commerce? Because it has been. And I'm not just talking about brand versus performance, though I would imagine that's an ingredient in the answer to this. But brand has been the greatest driver of commerce, certainly margin, ever.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think, I'm going to go into old school business strategy here, where fundamentally businesses have a choice. They can be a kind of commodity, and they can be
Yeah.
a high volume, low margin, low price sort of player, or they can choose to create brand as a strategic moat, and then make a choice to invest there and create, to your point, pricing power, differentiation, and value that is hard to replicate by any single competitor. And I think that's always been the case. I think, to your point, what happened, and we can go into a little bit of history of marketing here. You go through the last 40 years of marketing, and for 30 years, it was kind of the same. And about 10 or 15 years ago, it does go back to brand, and I hate the term performance marketing. I call it direct response because it all performs, divorced.
It
And
all should perform.
yeah, and it should perform. And
Yeah.
I'm sure we'll get into this. There's more and more ways to assess that. And essentially, there was this East Coast, West Coast, Tupac Biggie thing going on in our industry. And I just think, the rise of venture capital, the rise of all the money into direct to consumer companies, they were raising Series A, B, C rounds every 8 months. Venture capital money then went to direct response, where you could hit milestones in certain
Right.
dates, very short term, and
Where
brand
you're
got put
hacking
on the
growth, not
side burner.
necessarily sustaining growth.
Right. And brand got put on the side. The world is littered right now with DTC brands that entered what I call the CAC valley of death, right? Where you kind of spent a ton in direct response, and you essentially ran out of future customers to keep filling that barrel to bid on. And now there's less fish on the barrel, and CACs go up, and your brand doesn't have the unit economic sustainability to keep growing. And
Yeah.
I do think we are entering a world where the convergence of these two is starting to be understood. The best CMOs can talk to their boards about that in a very literate way, in a very unit economic way with their CFOs. And you've probably heard me say, I call this performance storytelling is the
Yeah.
job of converging brand and direct response.
I want to make sure that I understand and also that our listeners do. When you talk about unit economics, are you talking about COGS? What's your definition there? How are you using that phrase?
I'm talking about return on marketing from a payback standpoint, right?
Yeah,
Like, so if
okay.
I spend X dollars, I get returned on that investment in this many weeks, months, or years,
Years.
and
Sounds like a
different
Friends
businesses will
episode.
have different guardrails for that, depending on their business model. But that's specifically what I'm talking about. The love language of my CFO is the unit economics or the payback periods of my marketing dollars.
All right, I want to stick a pin in that because I absolutely want to get to that and to kind of, marketing's time lag, because one of the things that I don't think I've done a particularly good job in these first 10 episodes of the pod is really talking about how the rest of the C-suite, how CEOs and CFOs in particular ought to be understanding and considering the payback period, or I should say the payback periods, right? At least situationally. But before we get there, two things. Okay. If you think about the biggest tensions between a CMO, speaking broadly, right, and their C-suite colleagues, what do you think they are? And if you could wave a magic wand to address just one of them, which one would it be?
It actually goes back to what we were talking. And let me caveat by saying the onus is on the CMO. I'm a big
Yes.
believer in agency versus victim mindset. And so
Yes.
it is all on the CMO to figure this out, in my personal opinion. But I think the biggest tension is actually what we were talking about. It is how to drive efficient growth, right? Is the dollars that the investors and the C-suite are empowering you with, are they creating the return on investment from a payback period standpoint that the business needs? That's the
But
root
doesn't
cause of
that
it.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but doesn't that immediately then beg the question of what over what period of time, right? Because their orientation, I'm going to stereotype or generalize more than stereotype, is to back to the Friends theme song, this today, this week, this month, this quarter, certainly, and that kind of short-term focus, which is, by the way, very, from an empathetic standpoint, completely understandable. They've got the capital markets putting pressure on them and evaluating them based on that, not what might happen, a year hence. Doesn't that kind of just actually run the risk of punching sustainable, profitable, long-term growth, lifetime value of the enterprise, the accretive value of brand in the face?
Uh, it could, and this is where, if done poorly, which happens a lot, to your point, Seth, it definitely could. Again, I'm taking your bait on this is a podcast for CEOs and CFOs. What I would strongly suggest is that, again, the CMO should take the agency here, but what I would strongly suggest is that the CEO and CFO work with the CMO to determine the both short-term and long-term
Yes.
unit economic guardrails within which
Yeah.
they operate. Too often, either a CMO just accepts, the CFO says, here, this is how you're allowed to spend your money, or it's sort of the wrong model of assessing marketing performance. And so I think there's no way around it other than co-creating a language between the CEO, the CFO, the CEO, and your investors around the short-term and long-term return on marketing. And we can geek out on what that is. I'm happy to get into that with you, but there are models here that can do that. But I think too often the conversation gets left on not done. And then everyone's guessing each other's love language, and essentially ships diverge, and that starts to break things down.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree completely. Marketers need to do, chief marketers in particular, a much better job marketing internally and speaking the language of business, not the language of marketing, which even for marketers, I think is oftentimes kind of silly, even if shorthand. But I want to pick up something you just dropped, and you talked about Looking at my notes, a CFO coming to a CMO and telling them what they're allowed to spend. Can you think of a time in your own career, and it could, I suppose, be a story you've heard from one of your peers, where a CFO has told them what they can spend, and that dictate is completely divorced from the plan and strategy that was agreed to, or the results that are also agreed to?
100%. In a world where you truly understand the customer acquisition costs and the LTV to CAC sort of paybacks of your marketing spend, and again, we can
Hmm.
geek out on that. The biggest mistake I've seen made is when we measure marketing as a percent of sales, and you're essentially guardrailed to that. Again, it's a good notion to
Why is
have.
that a mistake?
Because in the world of at least the direct response side of the house, it is possible that you could be spending a lot more dollars with a very high incremental return on that investment. And in a world where you guardrail it to a certain marketing to revenue ratio, you don't always allow for those conversations. It's not that you shouldn't be having an awareness of your marketing to revenue, sort of marketing as a percent of sales. It is a very important indicator and comparison benchmark to other companies as you're sort of driving sort of, commercial value in your business. It's a very important indicator, but that can't be the only thing. And that's why you hear me focusing so much on paybacks. Because if the payback is good, just like you would in any other investment in a business, you should invest in it. And, let me give an example. Today, you have companies like Microsoft and others investing the highest levels ever in R&D to build out the GPUs for an AI revolution, right?
Right.
The spend on R&D in these companies is reaching unprecedented levels. And
Tens
that's
and tens
essentially
of
a payback
billions of dollars.
conversation,
Yeah.
right? That's a payback conversation. So marketing should be able to have that exact same conversation.
Look, I love that you brought that up. So I will say, yes, marketing should, but why do you think so many chief executives and CFOs, again, don't in fact look at marketing and understand marketing to be exactly the same type of investment that has returns not just over the long term, but in the short term and the long term? Because right, this is, and it's so trite. I hate that I'm bringing it up, but it's the, is marketing an expense versus an investment perspective, and there is no other investment that any of these C-suite folks make that they expect a certainty of return in an absolute certain period, and yet marketing seems to be the exception to that lived experience. And again, I talk a lot about it. It punches growth in the face.
It's a blessing and a curse to be a CMO. I'll use the Spider-Man quote since you're a quote fan, right? What
I
is the
know where you're
saying?
going.
With great power
Power.
comes great responsibility, right? And I take it as a compliment, honestly. It's because many of us are spending one of the biggest line items in a company's P&L every single year. And you've got to generate some level of cash on cash return. And some portion of that investment has to be immediate. But some of it, I think you have to have that conversation with your CEO and CFO, that some of it also you have to invest so that next year is okay and the year after that is okay. And I think candidly, Seth, if I'm just real about it, I think you have so many, our industry in marketing or as CMOs has evolved so much in the last 15 years. I just think you have different flavors of CMOs. And what has
100%.
happened is these flavors are like all talking to different C-suites in different ways. And so we have not created a consistent language for this conversation. And so in many ways, I think we've unintentionally divided ourselves from within, and this has created a translation problem with CEOs and CFOs from CMOs. And so I think we kind of did it to ourselves, to be honest.
I wrote about this when I first got to Forbes a few years ago now, which is actually the role of executive search in this conundrum, because I think most chief executives and CFOs don't understand that there are very different types of CMOs. Right, like if you're a CFO, there aren't that many different types. There are different levels of competency and brilliance, of course, capability, but there aren't really, at least. I don't know, maybe I'm completely fucking wrong. I'm no CFO, but I don't believe that to be the case, and that they don't understand that there are different types of CMOs oftentimes puts them in the position of hiring the wrong type for the right job. But we'll leave that to another day. I want to ask you I want to kind of bring an end to the payback conversation by asking you, so that we can move on, asking you if there are any kind of, for lack of a better word, playbook or frameworks that you can offer to our audience, all of the folks in our audience, CEOs, CMOs, aspiring CMOs and CEOs, on how they might consider institutionalizing, codifying a methodology for considering how they want to evaluate return on invested capital.
Yeah. So, every business will be a little bit different, but generally speaking, what I think I'm about to share is probably true for most businesses. And frankly, one of the first things I do when I'm in a new role is I'll sit down with the CFO and we will whiteboard these guardrails against what I'm about to share together, right? And just agree that, hey, if we do this, I want freedom within my framework, right? And then I will bring you the return you need. So let me just lay this out. I would say every business, and some more than others, right? There are better business models and worse business models, but most businesses have a customer value that accrues over 1 year, 2 years. So every business has, like, the average value of a customer that uses our product is $100 a year or $500 a year. Mm-hmm. Some businesses are, not as good business models, businesses where they're one and done businesses, where you have a one-time acquisition cost and a one-time transaction. Well, then your payback has to
or much longer life cycles when we look at B2B or categories like automotive, manufacturing, equipment.
This is why you're seeing recurring revenue businesses, subscriptions growing over time. Like every business is becoming a SaaS business or a recurring revenue business. And so I know I'm like geeking out with you a little bit on business models here, but it's all relevant. You have to understand the model, the business model, your revenue model, your commercial model, your monetization model for your business. And so I would say, to make it simple, understand the lifetime value of your customer. Sometimes that'll be a one-time purchase. Sometimes that'll be a 5-year, like, revenue retention stays very strong for 5 years because you have a subscription business where it's very predictable. You take that lifetime value, which let's say is $100, and you work with your CFO and you say, like, okay, well, when do you want the payback? So if a $500 1-year value and I'm spending $1,000 to acquire them, now I have a 2-year payback on that, right?
Right.
And so you just need to kind of first understand your lifetime value, agree on the payback period that you want. Some companies need it in 5 months. Some are okay with 2 years, depending on that company's kind of P&L situation. And then back that into a customer acquisition cost that matches that kind of lifetime value to acquisition ratio that you need, right? So I could go way deeper on it, but a lot of times there's an LTV to CAC ratio that I use and I load brand into, because that's sort of a longer term idea. And then I pull CAC, and that's essentially just the direct response side of my business. And that's the part that I want to turn immediately. So sometimes my DR, my direct response paybacks, are much shorter than my LTV to CAC payback. But as long as I go to my CFO and I say, put these all together, if I return this LTV to CAC to you, which captures brand and DR, is that okay? Generally, it's a really good discussion, and that works out really well.
What we were just saying reminds me of something that Joe Marchese said on the show, which is he talked to, if I always like to caveat because my memory is spotty as fuck, but I think I'm getting it right. What Joe talked about, brand is kind of, one of the great levers for bringing CAC down.
Over time, for sure.
Yeah.
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 So, you know, a moment ago we were talking about the fact that there are different types of CMOs. There are, of course, different types of challenges facing CMOs and enterprises, and as we look across the body of your career, kind of three things emerge to me, right? You have, from a category perspective, been the lead marketer when it was you were disrupting a category, creating a category, and reinvigorating a brand within a category, if not the category itself, which is I think a pretty unusual breadth for somebody who hasn't been on the agency side. And I'm wondering, as you look at kind of those three very different challenges, what do you see in common across them in terms of the role of marketing? And by the way, if there's nothing, share that. And what do you think that your C-suite colleagues need to understand about those different challenges and the role of marketing within SAME?
Look, truthfully, I think marketing is marketing, regardless of those challenges. I think as much as changed their industry, the fundamentals have remained pretty stable. And, what I would say is, I'm going to bring old school language back here in the context of all this new school we're talking about, which is ultimately know your audience, know the job to be done by your brand. Why is your brand being hired? And ensure your brand's kind of purpose or its reason for being is, sometimes the job to be done and the purpose get way too stretching, like it's like, really, like that brand is going to like change the world. That may not be the mission of that brand, and so make sure those are aligned, and then be absolutely relentless on ensuring it's leak proof, like that you are delivering what you said. It's do what you said. A brand is a promise, and from product to message to purpose to like the job you're doing every day, it's the same. I have an interesting, like an anecdote I use a lot. I know you're an anecdote guy. Anecdote I use a lot. 20 years ago, when the Dove Real Beauty campaign started, right? I use this a lot. The same team, right? It was all part of the personal care department, right, of a big CPG company. The same team was running the Axe Effect campaign. Like literally, people were sitting next to each other. And so you had a real beauty campaign going on, which is the idea of like, being real to yourself and not having these fake beauty standards. Meanwhile, the Axe Effect campaign was going on. The same company literally you put on Axe and women will like fall all over you without any kind of
so I think it's worth setting that context, because I know both these campaigns really well from my previous life. The Axe campaign, which has evolved culturally, not just from a messaging standpoint, was I think it's fair to say fairly misogynist and certainly objectifying at that time. It worked brilliantly, which says something about
my point is, though, that if you tried that today and there was any light in between, right, like what your brand says and what your company does or how its monetization model works, today you can't do it anymore. Marketers used to be able to put lipstick on a pig. That's not happening anymore. There is no chance of that, and I think that remains core no matter what situation you're in.
So I love the reference, and regular listeners of the show have heard me reference in turn Morgan Housel's book Same as Ever over and over again. I talk a lot about how Stephen King's 1974 JWT planning guide is as relevant today as it was in 1974, and we talk a lot about the relentless pace of change. You brought it up at the top of the show, that marketers are confronted by, that business is confronted by, and we don't talk a lot about the unchanging fundamentals, right? And that marketing remains, no matter everything that's changed, the job of influencing attitudes and behaviors such that you can drive commercial return over the long term, profitably and sustainably. And I think it's a point worth hitting. And it's actually the Dove example is a good segue to this question. One of the things I said, actually, I don't remember if I read this in your bio, but Chime has become the most loved brand in the financial services category. And I'm wondering two things as we get towards the end of this conversation: how you measure love, and how you know what the commercial efficacy and value of being a loved brand is.
Yeah. So we look, there's a few trackers out there, right? Companies that have tried to answer this question. If you remember back in the day, what was it? It was that remember
Love
Saatchi and
marks.
Saatchi
It
put
was
out
love
this
marks. Yeah.
yeah, love marks thing as
Yeah.
a tool. Um More recently, I've been using this other tool that I don't think I'll say the name, but I've been using this other tool that has been really helpful for me. And the reason I use it, it kind of has.
Are you not saying the name so as not to give away a competitive advantage, or?
Well, I know how picky you are about selling things when we're together, but
No. Use a tool if it can be useful to our. I
there are
mean,
great tools.
shout
This
it out.
tool's called Bera Brand Management, and it's like it's one tool that I use a lot in companies. But it's got 4 dimensions of love, right? And it's got sort of dynamism, sort of the benefits that it's delivering to you. It's got 4 different dimensions.
So,
The reason I'm
when you say
mentioning,
dimensions, you mean kind of proxies for love?
yeah, that ladder up to this
Right.
score that has been studied very deeply. But the reason I'm bringing this up and why love is important is actually the nature of our industry now. It used to be enough to be one of the most loved brands in a category. And yes, we track that. But actually, what I'm tracking is, am I one of the most loved brands in the mind of my consumer across all categories in general? And the reason that's so important is attention fragmentation, right? Like to actually win and create something new and disruptive,
Yeah.
a new brand or something that's trying to usurp incumbents or provide a new alternative to incumbents needs to be able to capture attention at scale well outside of the categories in which it competes.
That's right, because you're competing for that mind share and attention with every other brand, business thing, trying to reach your audience with their communication at a given time.
100%. So that love, that relevance has to extend far beyond your category if you are truly trying to create disruption at a scale that is well beyond your category. I think this is what happens. A lot of marketers or businesses will be like, I'm winning in my category, and that's a great start. Let's do that. And are you winning the mind share of your consumer? Because the battle for attention is real, and that's actually the ultimate currency: is, are you capturing the attention of your audience?
It's, when I got to Live Nation, which is now 15 years ago as CMO, one of the things I said was, we're not just competing with AEG, who, was another big promoter. We're competing with dinner at home. We're competing with dinner out with friends. We're competing with going to the movies, right? Which is, where are you going to spend your time and money for quote unquote entertainment, right? And I put it in quotes because it's, I think, much broader than the traditional context. And I think you're absolutely right. And I don't think that the C-suite understands that the competitive set is far bigger than the category. And so with that, one final question for you, which is, if you could offer any piece of advice or two to boards and C-suite leaders who are not the CMO about how to be better allies to marketing such that it is better positioned to drive the growth everybody's after, what would it be?
I think it would go back to maybe something I referenced earlier. It would be engage with your CMO on sort of the rules, the financial rules of engagement, right? Have a commercial conversation, not a marketing only conversation. Start with, what are the outcomes and the commercial outcomes you're looking for? What are the sort of economic guardrails that that allow you to invest strategically in marketing? And from there, allow your CMO to operate with freedom within those guardrails, and by the way, then hold that person accountable. If they are not delivering what they said, we probably shouldn't be in that job. And if we
on
are,
the terms that you agreed to, which
on the
is
terms that we
important.
agreed together,
Yeah.
not we're handed. And if we are, then, take care of that CMO, because it's hard to find a great one. So that's probably my advice would be do it together, not apart.
With that as the last word, Vineet, thank you so much for being with us. This was really great. Appreciate you.
Thanks, Seth. And thanks for everything you do for our community, man. We would not be where we are without you. So we appreciate
Well,
it.
I feel confident you would be maybe even in a better place, but I'll take the compliment. Appreciate you.
Thanks, man.
Thanks for listening to the CEO's Guide to Marketing. As I said up front, smash that subscribe button and give it 5 stars if you liked it. But if you didn't like it, you don't have to leave a rating. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.